Welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. I'm Li Qiuyuan, sitting in for Liu Xin. In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to make up for the missing pieces, some deliberately, of the puzzle. To join us in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Weibo, or WeChat. We'll live stream Headline Buster at 11 a.m. Beijing time on Thursdays and air the segment on TV at 11:30 a.m. on Fridays. Do join us during the live streaming and get in touch. We would love to receive and possibly read out your insightful comments. Now, we've all heard that all is fair in love and war, and Washington has too often upped the ante at his own perils. But when you play with fire, you get burned. America's star has been waning in the last decade or so, and the country is now increasingly on the defensive. It's also becoming paranoid as China makes huge strides in Latin America with increased trade and investment. In a typical case of NIMBYism, that is to say, not in my backyard, the U.S. still tries every trick in the book to denigrate China's achievements south of the border. And at the same time, the Biden administration is now having its own road to Damascus moment, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to Beijing on June 18th in an attempt to mend fences. So, the United States is clearly on the defensive, but is it blowing hot and cold and biding its time? Well, let's look at the recent geopolitical events. Hard on the heels of China's successful attempts to bring peace and stability in the Middle East, there has been a string of state visits from Latin American leaders. The Honduran President Xiomara Castro ended her historic trip to China on June 14th. It came after Brazilian President Lula da Silva wrapped up his fourth visit to China in April. Now, these are highly symbolic achievements. Why? Well, let's first take a look at Honduras. China and Honduras established diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level in March, right after Honduras decided to sever diplomatic relations with the Taiwan authorities. With Xiomara Castro's visit, both countries signed 17 bilateral cooperation documents in areas ranging from the Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure projects, economy and trade, technology, education, and other areas. President Castro also submitted a formal application to join the BRICS-led New Development Bank. Honduras said it firmly supports and abides by the One China principle and firmly backs China's efforts to realize national reunification. And now let's take a look at Brazil. Well, the new Lula administration has put the China-Brazil relations back on the right track after the anti-China rhetoric of his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro. President Lula put South-South cooperation high on the agenda in a bid to become part of an anti-hegemonic force that pushes toward a multipolar international order. Meanwhile, the U.S. seems to be at the end of its rope, with China's growing sway in Latin America and having to deal with the negative impact of its China policy. Washington now wants, surprise, surprise, to get its relations with China back on track. Well, on June 18th, the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Beijing for talks on managing tensions in the highest level U.S. visit since President Joe Biden took office. And during the meeting, Chinese President Xi Jinping urged actions to stabilize and improve China-U.S. relations and emphasized that whether the two countries can find the right way to get along bears on the future and destiny of humanity. So, how do the Western media analyze the seemingly reshuffling of the geopolitical deck? Is the U.S. back with a vengeance to win hearts and minds after a slew of bad news? An obscure paper published in December 2021 in CEPAL, an academic review that looks at Latin America's economies, drew my attention. It's got Latin America and China, mutual benefit or dependency. The article concludes that well-being in Latin America has increased, mainly owing to improvements in the terms of trade. And that's definitely a mutual benefit, isn't it? So how come headlines such as China's dollar diplomacy or allegations of China's tightening up its grip on LAC countries still prevail in the West and its allies? CNN ran an article and cast doubt on China's real motives. Lots of finger pointing here. It says Beijing is using China's huge market as both a carrot and a stick to peel away the remaining countries in an approach many experts label as, quote, dollar diplomacy. And as a quick reminder, the dollar diplomacy was a controversial U.S. policy in the 1900s aimed at putting pressure on foreign governments that U.S. officials and investors consider unstable. You know, like in The Godfather, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. Such practice has continued in ever-changing forms throughout the 20th century. And now, Is China engaged in such dollar diplomacy? Well, Honduras is a sovereign country, and it puts its money where its mouth is. Cooperation and development obviously take precedence over flimsy political considerations and financial pressure. President Xiomara Castro perfectly understands this rationale. And now even much scarier is the alleged China's tightening of its grip on Honduras and other Latin American countries, as seen in the Times. Well, China's growing influence is seen as increasing assertiveness and a factor of polarization, it says. Basically, countries have to take sides. And NPR echoes that mindset. The diplomatic victory for China comes as tensions rise between Beijing and the United States, including over China's increasing assertiveness towards self-ruled Taiwan, and signals growing Chinese influence in Latin America. In the article, a political analyst is quoted as saying that Beijing's narrative would highlight the benefits, including investment and job creation, but that is all going to be illusory. Illusory? Well, China and Honduras have already witnessed a year-on-year trade increase of 22.9% in the first 4 months of 2023. And China's colossal market has begun to step up its consumption of trademark Honduran produce since March. And as a sign of building on that rapid progress, President Xi Jinping committed China's firm support to Honduran economic and social development and called on both sides to prioritize efforts that lift people's livelihoods. So truth is, that's NIMBYism for you. Well, Washington's feathers have been ruffled as more countries in Central America, in South America, and in the Caribbean turn to China for development and cooperation. But what does Beijing want? Well, The Economist already has this answer, and it's not about fostering development and deepening cooperation. The simple answer could be, it's geopolitical, stupid. Well, China seems to be winning the geopolitical popularity contest, the article says, concluding that whether China's deeper engagement is a risk depends on the eye of the beholder, according to a Mexican official. So infrastructure projects, cooperation, and bilateral partnerships in the region have provided China with a footing that could be used for commercial, espionage, or even military purposes, such as deep water ports, telecommunication systems, surveillance technology, and space observatories, according to foreign policy. But the Western media failed to acknowledge that China has filled a void left by Washington's lack of interest in the region that it nevertheless considers as its backyard, a region that has suffered from Washington's heavy-handed approach in the last hundreds of years, if not more. And in many countries, memories of unrest and hardship are still vivid. In some cases, ordinary people continue to pay the price for Washington's erratic foreign policy, or I should say lack of it. Ask people in Central America, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Argentina, and in Chile. Now it's interesting to observe that in such troubled times, the United States is eager to bury the hatchet with China. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Beijing last Sunday and met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Can we expect Washington to eat humble pie and take the road to Damascus? Well, that's what it looks like anyway. The China-U.S. relations have a record low recently, and the fence mending starts with little progress, one step at a time. And that's what Antony Blinken said in his tweet. Through open channels of communication, it's not going to be all roses. But there are still media that would rather see the optimistic side, such as this editorial piece from Washington Post titled, "Blinken is traveling a long way to talk with China. Good." Well, Blinken's trip might not be enough, it says, but, and I quote, "It's essential to renew dialogue, especially military to military talks. Keeping channels of communication open is essential among adversaries and competitors. A high-level visit, the kind that used to be routine, is a good place to start." Well, even U.S. President Biden told reporters, "We are on the right trail here," adding that Blinken had made progress on its 2-day trip, which concluded on Monday. China has been keen on telling the world that the Chinese market is more than ever open for business. The corporate world in the U.S. heard the message loud and clear. Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates, meeting with President Xi a couple of weeks ago, followed visits to Beijing by JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, Starbucks CEO Laxman Narasimhan, and Tesla and Twitter CEO Elon Musk. All the talk about decoupling and de-risking in the West might just be sheer rhetoric, aimed at domestic audiences. The U.S. has probably realized that it may well be hoisted by its own petard and suffer the consequences of its adversarial approach to foreign affairs, which has been at times plainly antagonistic. So, Will Washington's road to Damascus herald a more conciliatory approach to solving disputes? Can the U.S. share its Latin American backyard with China in a way conducive to stability and development? Or is the U.S. blowing hot and cold and just biding its time? Well, don't go away. We'll ask our guests after this short break. Stay with us.
Following the establishment of diplomatic ties with China, students in Honduras are being offered what could be life-altering new opportunities. A cross-Pacific academic exchange program now seeks to offer Honduras's most promising students spots at China's top educational institutions.
China has offered hundreds of places at its top international universities as part of a very large and innovative academic exchange program.
For this Central American country, it's a leg up towards its own development.
We are interested in engineering and water management in particular, and China has been very successful in those fields. So for us, it is key to learn from what China can teach us through the formation of these human resources.
News of the upcoming opportunities to study across the Pacific has spread fast. The Social Development Ministry here says it has received more than 200 applications from Honduran students looking to study abroad at Chinese universities just since formal relations were established in March. It's an academic exchange aimed at deepening these countries' ties. For students at this country's leading university, the exchange is an enticing prospect.
I would love to study in China because I would learn new things. If I could share my Spanish there and learn to speak Mandarin, I could teach that language in Honduras later.
I would love it. China is very advanced. They have a greater understanding of our subjects, and that would be experience we could bring back home.
Mathematics professor Mariano Solórzano also sees the academic offerings across the Pacific as a great opportunity.
China is a power when it comes to mathematics. The country has taken first place in the past 4 Math Olympics. So for our youth with talent, to maximize their potential, establishing an academic relationship with China could be highly productive.
With opportunities to study in China now open to them, Honduras's next generation says it wants to bring the best Asia has to offer back to Central America. Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Tegucigalpa, Honduras.
Welcome back to Headline Buster. We want to get more perspectives on the China-U.S. relations after a series of high-stake visits, and we're now joined by an awesome panel. Let me introduce them to you. We're joined by Mr. Yang Xiyue, political analyst, joining me in Beijing online, and Mr. Rafael Henrique Zerbeto, Brazilian Esperanto expert, the Center for Asia Pacific, joining us also here in Beijing via Skype. And last but not least, Mr. James Heimowitz, honorary chair of the China Institute in America. He is joining us from New York. Great to see all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's talk about this. Let's start with the latest development. I mean, the Honduras president has just visited China not too long after the Brazilian president's trip to Beijing. And a lot of people have brought up the Monroe Doctrine once again, which has been a long-standing tenet of the U.S. foreign policy in the rest of Americas. And now China is seeing as gnawing away at Washington's dominant influence in that region, and Washington is not happy about it. Mr. Zerbeto, let me start with you. What do you think?
It's clear for me that President Lula wants closer ties with China, but it doesn't mean that we are opposing the U.S. Just Brazil has a tradition of no-alignment. We understand that for Brazil, it's better to have good relations with different countries and try to take benefits from the cooperation with those different countries. We are not looking for a Cold War in Latin America or something like that. So when Lula comes to China, that's his signal that he knows that China's economy is growing. China is bringing opportunities for other countries around the world. And also Brazil wants to take the benefits of the development of China. You know, Chinese companies are investing a lot in Brazil. Brazilian exports are also the biggest portion goes to China. So it's normal. China is the biggest commercial partner of Brazil. We must have good relations. But yes, the United States tend to see this as a threat because they traditionally see Latin America as its backyard. So this tension must be solved in some way. But Brazil, as an independent country, must pursue its own interests rather than the interests of another country.
Yeah, a lot of people are seeing this as a tense three-way tangle right among the United States, China, and Latin America. But the truth is, like Brazil, a lot of countries in Latin America, they do not want to choose sides. They're just fighting for the things in their best interests. But Mr. Yang, the fear that China would encroach on Washington's influence by carving out its own sphere of influence in the region is almost unavoidable. It's now going away. But talk to us about Beijing's perspective. What kind of vision is held by Beijing on this?
I think Beijing have a very solid guidance and a very clear mindset that China wants to conduct and develop the win-win cooperation with all American countries. Although no matter those countries have been regarded by the United States as the so-called backyard, simply because we look at all sovereign countries in the world, among U.S., among Latin American country, among including China, all of the sovereign countries are equal footing, and all sovereign countries have the right to decide to develop cooperations with any partner if they like. So based on this mindset, and China increasingly feel that Latin American countries have an increasing interest in strengthening increasing ties with China, so that China have the shared interest. Then the two sides have the shared vision, shared interest. Then we do it. When we disregard any third party's mindset or concerns, for example, the United States, we do understand that U.S. has a long time doctrine as a moral doctrine, as you mentioned. And although today no American keep talking about moral doctrine, but in mind, they always regard all Latin American as their own private backyard, and we do not regard this doctrine by Americans simply because we believe all Latin American countries have the equal footing sovereignty with the United States. If Latin American countries like to develop and strengthen ties with China, and China will go. That is China's mindset. Just based on the shared vision, shared interest between China and the Latin American countries, then we increase our inputs, efforts for all dimension cooperations, regardless what concerns the United States has.
Mr. Hamowitz, let me bring you into this. Your reaction to what's been said there, your thoughts on the Monroe Doctrine, is that still relevant?
Well, first, thank you so much for including me here. I think it's so important for people around the world, particularly in China, to be more closely connected with what people are thinking and feeling in the U.S. And I think what's coming out here is that no matter whether America likes it or not, China is emerging as a global leader. And the world, and particularly America, is taking this, really thinking hard about this and saying, what kind of a leader is China becoming? How will its leadership style, take shape, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Africa, or whether it's the way the two most important countries, China and US, interact with each other. And I think that's what we're sort of experiencing now, is people standing back and watching Americans' behavior, how America has behaved over the past few decades, and increasingly the way that China is interacting with its close neighbors, as well as neighbors or countries that are a little bit more far-flung but are deeply connected, as Rafael and the others have talked about, the connectivity between Latin America and China.
Yeah.
So I think I think the jury's pretty much out on that. And I think people are sort of watching and trying to understand what kind of values are going to emerge.
And looking at the Western media coverage of it, Mr. Heimowitz, looking at the Western coverage after Honduras president visiting China, what are your thoughts? Because they are making it look like it's another nail on the in the coffin of America's global dominance.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it that way. I think what there is people looking and saying, you know, I think that America's leadership role had certain characteristics that were very, very different from the way that China is engaging. And I wouldn't say that it's a nail in the coffin, but I would say that it's cautionary. And I would say that people are watching. If you look recently, you can see that I think both sides are eager to sort of repair and move forward. You talked a little bit earlier on about Secretary Blinken's visit to Beijing. This is really important. You know, not so much in what was accomplished, but because it's a restart. And I think it's important that senior leadership people in the US are actually visiting China. So I think that's a good start.
And Rafael, your thoughts on this? How would you explain the media reactions after both Brazilian president and Honduras president's visit to China?
Well, when we talk about Brazil specifically, Brazilian media, we have just some families who own most of Brazilian media, the biggest Brazilian media companies. So we don't have much diversity. And also US companies are those who mostly announce on Brazilian media. So it gives Brazilian media some tendency to be to defend and support the interests of the US. But we also have alternative media channels, especially nowadays on websites that are showing other points of views. So internet helped to make media a little bit more democratic than before. But basically, many Brazilian media, they just share what is produced by foreign media, by like US media, European media. This is one problem that we have to deal with. But essentially, this media coverage, it expresses the situation nowadays that we have a power transition coming. China is a rising power. But we have the biggest, the hegemonic media abroad. It's basically committed to the West that is losing its power, losing its influence, and trying to fight against it.
And Rafael, why do you think more and more countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are looking to China and China solutions? What real benefits do they see?
Because well, China has the biggest consumer market in the world, and this market is developing very fast, and China is growing its imports. Also, Chinese companies are expanding to other countries, are creating jobs, are investing in infrastructure, in many things that are of the interest of those countries. So I can compare like with the US in the past, before and after the Second World War, when the US became the world power. They were investing a lot in Latin America. It was a good partnership. American companies invested a lot in Latin America at that time and helped Latin America to grow and to give a better life to the people. But nowadays, especially since the 90s, the United States have been basically doing investments in the sense that you have they are financing things, but they are like speculating in Latin American countries and just bringing the money away, right? And China is now investing in the real economy of those countries. So Chinese companies go to Latin America, they really put money there, they buy our production, they create jobs and even better jobs. And this is what Latin America is in need right now. So this creates a different situation, right? The US basically want there are like some investors who go to the stock market in Latin America to speculate and make money. But China comes with jobs and with investments that will create benefits for the local people.
But despite of that, we often hear allegations, Mr. Yang, allegations of dollar diplomacy and debt trap diplomacy when we speak about China building infrastructures, building partnerships with countries in the global south and invest and increase their trade there. This narrative is not going away.
Well, I think what you all mentioned stem from two reasons. One reason is intentionally demonize China's efforts to develop economic ties with all developing countries. Many of those countries were used to be the Western countries' colonial powers. And now China's influences, China's ties, China's cooperation has increasingly more and more than the ties, the previous colonized relations. So from very dark psychology, they intentionally demonize all China's efforts to be bad. And secondly, such narratives stem from a mindset saying always analyze the purpose of a gentleman with very dark logic of a villain. During the past, many Western countries get loans to developing countries, but with very strict preconditions. I want to point at one key point, say the difference between Chinese loan and the previous Western countries' loans to developing country lies in the preconditional or non-preconditional. All China's efforts to loan, to invest, to cooperate with many means are based on very clear principles, say no any precondition. Quite different from the previous Western countries behaves in the developing countries. So with or without precondition is the key. Precondition used by Western countries to dictate, to intervene, to guide the recipients' development, recipients' domestic policies. And without precondition means all the cooperation partners are equal footing, and China as a partner pay full respects on the other partner's sovereignty. So that is the key difference. And based on the non-precondition, all narratives demonize the words are groundless and useless. I think with time going, more and more people, including people from Western world, will recognize more and more clearly that Chinese way to loan to the developing countries are totally different from what the Western country did during the past and now.
Mr. Han, I want to give you a chance to respond here. Help us understand the U.S. perspectives on this. Why are they approaching this matter this way?
Well, sure, I'd like to give that a try. And I fully agree with you that, the United States or certain, media voices or sectors in the United States have indeed demonized many of the things that many of China's initiatives. I've worked closely, for example, with Confucius Institutes, and I watched how that had become weaponized. I looked at, what Confucius Institutes did. They tried to help foreigners better understand China by giving them the skills they need to communicate in Chinese. Yet you're very right. This has gotten somehow twisted and warped in the US and it's become weaponized. To me, this is emblematic of a very poor state of communications, a very poor state of understanding. And it means we need to double down and reinvest in sort of obliterating that ignorance and getting both sides a little bit more comfortable. There's too much highly charged rhetoric going around. And how do we sort of calm that down and raise the level of understanding and awareness? I think we need to go back to the basics. And the basics are connecting people. Most Americans have very little insight or understanding of what China looks and feels like today. And that problem has been exacerbated by first COVID and now the tense relationship. So many fewer Americans are visiting China, and for that matter, Chinese to the US, but it's particularly pronounced with the precipitous drop of Americans, whether it's students, businessmen, academics, across every sort of field, we see a tremendous drop. And so I think that until we move forward and we increase those levels of connectivity and understanding and communication, these kinds of misperceptions are only going to become worse.
I want to get to Blinken's trip to Beijing. The main message from the readout after his meeting with Qinggang was to keep channels of communication open. Mr. Hamowitz, help us understand, what does that mean in plain language?
Well, what it means in plain language, first, I'd really like to set it and say, I think that the government isn't actually taking the lead here. In my view, government lags behind, and that's kind of good that it's not a leading indicator. That means that there are forces in the US, business community, academic community, other places that would very much like to see a healthier, more robust dialogue and interaction and relationship. So I guess the way to look at this, and I think it was very meaningful that we sent somebody as senior as Secretary Blinken to go, and I think it was equally meaningful and tremendously helpful that President Xi met with him. So, this is what a mature relationship is about. It doesn't always mean that it's easy. It doesn't always mean that, there's no friction or problems, but what it means is both sides feel a level of comfort where they can share those concerns and anxieties and begin to address them and chip away at what the concerns are and slowly making it, advances. Because as I said earlier in this discussion, clearly, this is the planet's most consequential relationship, and it's too important for us just to watch it spiral downwards.
Oh, definitely. But just days after the Beijing talks, Mr. Yang, President Biden referred to President Xi as a dictator when he was talking about the balloon incident in February. What is happening there?
Well, I think from the balloon incident to the latest remarks by Biden really reflects U.S. policy towards China based on the so-called two-hand tactics. We Chinese call it as a 两手策略. That means on one hand, U.S. always try all efforts to contain China, put all pressures in maximum manners. But on the other hand, they do concern about the out of control by China's counteroffensive. Chinese, they concern China's potential counteroffensive against their maximum pressure or containment measures. Therefore, the other hand, they try to set up the so-called handrail through dialogues. So that is the purpose. The second hand of the consideration is the purpose of Blinken's visit. Say they keep doing maximum pressure on China, but meanwhile, they try every effort to set up the so-called handrail to prevent the relation between the two big powers from out of control. So that is their mindset, that is their tactics. That is why Chinese has a very deep distrust against the US. We welcome dialogues with the American partners. However, we insist we should not conduct talks for talks. We need to have a talks for results. And unfortunately, for American part, based on the so-called two-hand tactics, they keep doing maximum pressure on China, provocative for China's dignity, but on the other hand, try to calm down China, not go to the offensive, counter-offensive measure. That is the difficulties and the obstacles for the very meaningful dialogues between the two countries that impede the two countries from getting achievements just because they were their two-hand tactics.
Mr. Hamowitz, I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, with the 2024 elections coming, the Biden administration is obviously facing tremendous pressure both at home and abroad. Which way could he go? Could he go even tougher? Will we hear a much more anti-China rhetoric, or would we see his administration striking for a more conciliatory tone?
That's a really, really interesting question. And, the two systems are so different in the United States and in China. And Joe Biden has to answer to the voters in a very different kind of a way than operates in China. So what you've asked, really we need to keep a careful watch, because what it speaks to is really the state is emblematic of the state of relations between China and the US. And I personally hope that we will see a bit more brain and a little bit less heart coming into the situation. I believe that what we've just witnessed is a really good start. And I think what we need more of is dialogue, engagement, addressing these kinds of issues and concerns at all levels, both at the business level, as we've talked about, all the different sectors, not just government. Because, as I said, I think government is emblematic of the state of relationship, not really driving it.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of CEOs from America visiting China. There seems like there's a temperature gap there. It's almost like there's a disconnect there in the business world and the politics. Final question over to you, Rafael. I want to get your take on this. How are you looking at this trip by Blinken to China? Could there be something serious in the offing?
Well, yeah, I think this trip happened in a special moment. We see a growing tension between China and the US. So one point is the situation in the Taiwan Straits. So this brings us much concern. So both sides, China and US, they need to come to an agreement in the sense that the US should stop provoking China with the Taiwan issue. This is an internal affair of China and should be respected. And also about Latin America, the US, they have the moral doctrine. They consider Latin America as their backyard. So I think they use like this situation, like this view of them, like to push China away from Latin America, even though Latin American countries want to strengthen their ties with China.
All right, I'm afraid this is all the time we have for now. This is such an important topic. The disagreements between the two here could have serious implications for global security and stability. That is why it is so important to keep communications lines open to avoid misunderstanding. Thank you so much for contributing all your insights and perspectives. Always great to have you with us on the show. And that's going to do it for our headline buster here on CGTN. Thank you so much for your company, and bye for now.